I'm Rachel Martinez, and 3 days ago, my twin sister Rebecca walked through my front door, carrying the same purple backpack she had when she died 20 years ago. She looked exactly the same as the day she vanished. 19 years old, wearing her lucky silver earrings and smiling like she'd just stepped out to grab coffee instead of being buried in Riverside Cemetery with a headstone that still has fresh flowers on it every month. The woman who destroyed my childhood, who made me believe I was the broken half of our pair, who died in a car crash in 2004, just asked me if I had any of that chamomile tea she used to love. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But let me tell you something about seeing ghosts. Sometimes they're not the ones who are haunting you. I've spent 20 years building a life on the foundation of being the twin who survived. Every morning, I wake up in my Tempe townhouse knowing that I'm living for two people now. Every achievement, every milestone, every small victory, I've carried the weight of representing both Rachel and Rebecca Martinez in this world. My parents introduced me to their friends as their daughter. Singular, the one who made it through the tragedy. My therapist called it survivor's guilt. My fiancé Kevin calls it my superpower. This drive to prove that the universe didn't make a mistake by taking her instead of me. The thing about being an identical twin is that people expect you to be incomplete without your other half. Rebecca and I were born 7 minutes apart on a scorching July afternoon in Phoenix. And from the moment we took our first breaths, everyone treated us like we were two halves of the same person. Rebecca was the bold one, the leader, the twin, who spoke first and walked first and made friends first. I was Rachel, Rebecca's shadow, the quiet one who followed 3 steps behind and finished her sentences. Growing up in our Ahwatukee neighborhood, Rebecca commanded every room we entered. She had this magnetic energy that drew people to her like she was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets orbiting in her light. At Desert Ridge High School, she was student body president, captain of the debate team, and somehow managed to date the quarterback while maintaining a perfect GPA. I was Rebecca Martinez's twin sister, the one who helped with her campaign posters and stayed up late typing her essays when she was too busy being spectacular. Our parents, David and Linda Martinez, never meant to play favorites, but Rebecca made it impossible not to. She was everything they had dreamed their daughters would become: confident, charismatic, destined for greatness. Dad would beam with pride when Rebecca argued politics at the dinner table, her dark eyes flashing with passion as she defended her positions. Mom would brag to her nursing colleagues about Rebecca's acceptance to USC, how she was going to study international relations and change the world. And me? I was the artistic one, which, in our house, meant the impractical one. While Rebecca debated foreign policy, I sketched portraits in the margins of my notebooks. While she planned rallies and organized charity drives, I lost myself in photography, capturing the quiet moments everyone else overlooked. My parents smiled politely when I showed them my work, the same way they smiled at amateur hour performances. They loved me, I knew that, but love and pride are different things entirely. The pattern was set so deeply that even I believed it. Rebecca was the important twin, the one with a future worth investing in. I was the sidekick, the supporting character in the story of her magnificent life. When college application time came around, Rebecca applied to 12 schools and got into 11. I applied to 3 art programs and got into 1, Portland Art Institute, a small school in Oregon that offered me a partial scholarship for photography. The night before Rebecca left for USC, she found me sitting on our shared bedroom floor, surrounded by half-packed boxes and uncertainty. She sat down next to me, her legs crossed in that casual way she had, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was almost sad, tinged with something that looked like regret. "Rach," she said, using the nickname only she was allowed to call me. "You know you don't have to live in my shadow forever, right?" I looked up from the camera I was carefully wrapping in bubble paper. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe it's good that we're going to different schools. Maybe you need space to figure out who you are when you're not standing next to me." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I had never existed independently of Rebecca Martinez. Even my name felt incomplete without hers attached to it. "I don't know how to be just Rachel," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She reached over and touched my hand. her fingers warm and familiar. Then learn, because I have a feeling that when you do, you're going to be incredible. Those were the last words my sister ever said to me. Rebecca left for Los Angeles on a Tuesday in August 2004, loaded down with dreams and designer luggage our parents had bought for her going-away present. I left for Portland on a Thursday with a second-hand suitcase and a knot of anxiety in my stomach that wouldn't loosen. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone, and it was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Portland was everything Phoenix wasn't. Gray and green and full of coffee shops where artists actually talked about art instead of treating it like a hobby. The Pacific Northwest rain felt like a baptism, washing away the desert dust and the expectations I'd carried for 19 years. At the Art Institute, nobody knew I had a twin sister. Nobody knew I'd spent my entire life being compared to someone else. For the first time, I was just Rachel, and I had no idea who that person was supposed to be. The first month was brutal. I called home crying 3 times a week, begging Mom to let me transfer to ASU, where at least I'd be close to familiar desert landscapes and family dinners. Rebecca called me every Sunday evening, full of stories about sorority life and college parties, and professors who challenged her in ways high school never had. She sounded so alive, so perfectly suited to her new world, while I felt like I was drowning in mine. But slowly, something shifted. My photography professor, Mrs. Chen, was a small Taiwanese woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. She pulled me aside after class one October afternoon when I'd turned in a series of self-portraits that I thought captured my loneliness, but she saw differently. "You photograph pain beautifully," she said, spreading my prints across her desk, "but I think you're mistaking isolation for identity. Being alone isn't the same as being yourself." "I don't know the difference," I confessed. "Then let's find out." Mrs. Chen became my unlikely mentor, pushing me to explore themes I'd never considered. Under her guidance, I started a series called Invisible Voices, photographing people who were overlooked, homeless individuals, elderly grocery store clerks, janitors working night shifts. Through my lens, I discovered that I had a gift for seeing the humanity in people others ignored. It was the first time I'd ever been good at something Rebecca wasn't better at. By November, I was actually looking forward to photography classes. By December, I'd made my first real friend, a sculpture major named Jake Thompson, who had grown up in foster care and understood what it meant to create your own identity from scratch. By January, I was starting to believe that maybe Rebecca had been right. Maybe I could be incredible, just in a completely different way than she was. That's when the phone call came. It was a Tuesday night, January 18th, 2005. I was in the darkroom developing prints for my final portfolio when someone knocked on the door. Jake stuck his head in, his usually cheerful face grave. "Rachel, you need to call home. Emergency. The drive from Los Angeles to Sear at Portland Art Institute with a 3.9 GPA and a photography portfolio that won the Departmental Excellence Award." I dedicated it to Rebecca's memory, but privately I knew I'd created it for myself. The girl who had spent 19 years believing she was the wrong twin had finally started to discover what the right Rachel might look like. The next 3 years passed in a blur of creative growth and painful self-discovery. I changed my major to graphic design with a photography minor, realizing that I had a talent for visual storytelling that could actually support me financially. I threw myself into internships and freelance projects, building a portfolio that spoke to my ability to find beauty in unexpected places. I learned to introduce myself without mentioning that I had been a twin, to exist in rooms without scanning for Rebecca's approval or competition. But grief isn't linear, and healing isn't clean. There were nights when I called Rebecca's old cell phone just to hear her voicemail message. There were days when I caught sight of my reflection and felt startled by the face looking back. So familiar, yet somehow wrong without its mirror image beside it. I went to therapy, joined a support group for people who had lost siblings, and slowly began to understand that survivor's guilt isn't something you overcome as much as something you learn to carry. By my senior year, I had transformed into someone I barely recognized. I was confident in ways that had nothing to do with comparison. I spoke up in classes, defended my creative choices, and even started dating. something I'd never done in high school, because Rebecca's boyfriends had always made it clear which twin they preferred. I was still quiet by nature, but it was a chosen quietness now, not the timid silence of someone who didn't believe she deserved to be heard. When graduation approached, I faced a choice that would have been automatic 4 years earlier. Mom and Dad wanted me to come home to Phoenix, to be close to family, to help them navigate their ongoing grief over Rebecca. Portland had become my home, the place where I'd discovered who Rachel Martinez could be when she wasn't competing with anyone for space. But Mrs. Chen offered me something that changed everything. "I'm retiring next year," she told me during our final critique session. "The college is looking for someone to run a new program, art therapy for trauma survivors. It would be part teaching, part community outreach. You'd be working with people who are trying to rebuild their identities after loss." The job description could have been written for me. Everything I'd learned about photography, about finding beauty in pain, about discovering yourself when your old identity has been stripped away. It all seemed to lead to this moment. I would be helping other people navigate the same journey I'd been on for 4 years. But taking the job meant staying in Portland permanently. It meant building a life that was completely separate from Rebecca's memory, from my parents' grief, from the girl I'd been before tragedy forced me to grow up. It felt like the ultimate betrayal of my family, but also like the most honest choice I could make. I called home on a rainy April evening, sitting in my tiny studio apartment surrounded by photographs I'd taken over the past 4 years. Images of homeless veterans, elderly nursing home residents, children in foster care, all the invisible people I'd learned to see through Mrs. Chen's guidance. When Dad answered the phone, I could hear the television in the background and Mom's voice asking if it was me. "I got offered a job," I said without preamble. "That's wonderful, Misha. Doing what?" I explained about the art therapy program, about working with trauma survivors, about the opportunity to turn my own experience with loss into something that could help other people heal. Dad listened without interrupting, and I could picture him nodding thoughtfully the way he always did when he was processing complex information. "That sounds like important work," he said finally. "Rebecca would be proud." The words should have made me happy, but instead they made me angry and preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A way that surprised me. 4 years after losing my twin, I was still being measured against her memory. Still being evaluated through the lens of what Rebecca would have thought, or felt, or wanted. I realized that as long as I stayed in Phoenix, I would always be Rebecca's surviving twin first and Rachel's second. "Dad," I said carefully, "I love you and Mom more than anything. But I need to take this job. I need to stay in Portland and build something that's completely mine." There was a long silence, filled with the weight of everything we weren't saying. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice thick with emotion I couldn't identify. "Your mother and we've been so focused on missing Rebecca that maybe we haven't been paying enough attention to celebrating the daughter we still have. If this is what you need to do to be happy, then we support you completely." I cried that night for the first time since the memorial service, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of relief, of permission finally granted to live my own life on my own terms. I was 23 years old, and I was finally, fully, only Rachel Martinez. The art therapy program launched 6 months later with me as its director. We started small, a handful of workshops for local support groups, some partnerships with social service agencies. But word spread quickly about the young woman who used photography to help people tell their stories, who understood what it meant to rebuild your identity from the ground up. Within 2 years, we were running programs for veterans, for abuse survivors, for people who had lost family members to addiction or violence or accidents. I found my calling in those community centers and support group meetings, helping people discover that their pain could become part of their strength, instead of something they needed to overcome. Through my work, I met incredible humans who had survived unimaginable losses and chosen to keep living anyway. They taught me that resilience isn't about bouncing back to who you were before trauma struck. It's about becoming someone new who can hold both the pain and the beauty of existence without breaking. My personal life blossomed too. I started dating Kevin Walsh, a social worker I met at a conference on trauma-informed care. Kevin had grown up as an only child and couldn't quite understand the complex grief of losing a twin. But he loved me fiercely and completely as Rachel, not as anyone's other half. He proposed on a hiking trail in the Columbia River Gorge, with Portland spread out below us like a promise of the life we were building together. By the time I turned 30, I had created something I'd never thought possible, a life that was entirely my own. I owned a small house in southeast Portland, with a garden full of the vegetables Rebecca used to hate, and flowers that bloomed in seasons she'd never seen. I had a career that felt like a calling, helping other people navigate the transformation that trauma demands. I had a partner who saw me clearly and loved what he saw. I had friends who knew my story but didn't define me by it. But I also had a secret that I'd never told anyone, not even Kevin, not even my therapist. Sometimes, usually late at night when I was walking home from work, or sitting alone in my dark room, I felt Rebecca's presence so strongly it took my breath away. Not in a supernatural way, but in the bone-deep certainty that she was supposed to be there, that the world was fundamentally wrong without her in it. I'd catch myself buying 2 cups of coffee or setting an extra place at dinner before remembering that I lived alone now, that I'd lived alone for years. The feeling got stronger as I approached my 40th birthday. Maybe it was the milestone itself, the realization that I was about to live longer without Rebecca than I had lived with her. Maybe it was the success of the art therapy program, which had grown into a nonprofit organization that served hundreds of people each year. Maybe it was the wedding planning, the strange loneliness of choosing a dress without a built-in best friend to cry with in the fitting room. I started having dreams about Rebecca that were so vivid I'd wake up expecting to find her in the kitchen making her terrible coffee and arguing with the morning news. In these dreams, she hadn't aged at all. She was still 19, still full of plans to change the world, still wearing those lucky silver earrings Dad had given us for our 18th birthday. She would look at me with curious eyes and ask why I looked so old, why I seemed so sad, why I was living in Oregon instead of conquering the world the way we'd always planned. I thought we were going to do great things together, Dream Rebecca would say, and I'd try to explain about the accident, about the years of therapy, about learning to be myself without her. But in the dreams, she never quite understood why I'd given up on the life we were supposed to share. I mentioned the dreams to Kevin one morning over breakfast, trying to make light of them even though they left me feeling unsettled for hours afterward. "It's probably just pre-wedding anxiety," he said reasonably, spreading peanut butter on his toast with methodical precision. "Big life changes bring up old grief sometimes. Maybe you should talk to Dr. Rivera about it." He was probably right. Dr. Rivera had been my therapist for 8 years, guiding me through the long process of learning to live as a singleton after a lifetime of twinship. She would have practical explanations for the dreams, techniques for managing the anxiety, strategies for moving forward. But something held me back from making that appointment. The dreams didn't feel like anxiety. They felt like preparation. 3 weeks before the wedding, I decided to make one final trip to Phoenix to visit Rebecca's grave. I hadn't been back to Riverside Cemetery since the 5th anniversary of her death. But something was pulling me there. Kevin offered to come with me, but this felt like something I needed to do alone. The cemetery had changed in the 15 years since the memorial service. New sections had been added, filled with people who had lived and died while Rebecca remained forever 19. But her grave was exactly as I remembered it. A simple headstone with her name and dates, always decorated with fresh flowers that Mom brought every month without fail. I sat cross-legged on the desert ground beside the headstone, feeling the familiar Phoenix heat bake through my jeans, and wondering what to say to a sister who had been gone longer than she'd been alive. The words that came out surprised me. "I'm getting married next month," I told the carved granite, "to a good man who loves me exactly as I am. I have a career I'm proud of, helping people heal from trauma. I own a house with a garden full of vegetables you would have complained about. I've built a life you never could have imagined, because it's nothing like the life you planned for us." The desert wind moved through the mesquite trees, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "But Rebecca, I'm so tired of living for both of us. I'm tired of wondering what you would think about my choices. Tired of feeling guilty for being happy when you'll never have the chance to grow up. I need to let you go completely, not because I love you less, but because I need to love myself more." I stayed at the grave until sunset painted the mountains purple and gold, talking to Rebecca about everything I'd never been able to say when she was alive. About how her confidence had made me doubt myself. About how her death had forced me to become someone I never would have been otherwise. About how grateful I was for both the pain and the growth, even though I would trade all of it to have her back. When I finally stood to leave, I felt lighter somehow. Like I'd set down a burden I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it wasn't part of my body. The dreams stopped after that visit. The sense of Rebecca's presence faded to a gentle awareness. Like background music playing so softly you only notice it when it stops. I flew back to Portland and threw myself into wedding planning with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including me. For the first time, I was genuinely excited about the future. Instead of constantly looking over my shoulder at the past, Kevin and I were going to build something together that had nothing to do with loss or grief or survivor's guilt. We were going to be happy, purely and simply, without apology. The wedding was small and perfect. 50 guests in Kevin's parents' backyard, surrounded by Oregon's late summer abundance. I wore a dress I'd chosen completely on my own, without wondering what Rebecca would have thought about the neckline or the length. My parents flew up from Phoenix, looking older but somehow more relaxed than I'd seen them in years. Dad walked me down the makeshift aisle with tears in his eyes, and when the officiant asked if anyone objected to our union, I didn't hold my breath waiting for a voice from the past to speak up. We honeymooned in Italy, spending 2 weeks eating pasta and taking photographs and making love in pension beds, while Mediterranean lights streamed through ancient windows. It was the first vacation I'd ever taken without bringing work along, without feeling guilty about enjoying myself. I was Mrs. Rachel Martinez Walsh now, and that hyphenated name felt like a bridge between who I'd been and who I was becoming. We came home to Portland in September, ready to start our married life in earnest. Kevin had accepted a promotion to supervise the county's trauma counseling program. I had plans to expand our art therapy nonprofit into rural communities across Oregon. We'd found a bigger house in southeast Portland, with enough space for Kevin's books and my darkroom and maybe, eventually, children who would grow up knowing they were wanted exactly as they were. For 3 months, life was everything I dreamed it could be. Kevin and I fell into comfortable routines. Morning coffee together before work, evening walks around the neighborhood, lazy Sunday mornings reading the paper in bed. I felt settled in a way I'd never experienced before. Grounded in a present that wasn't haunted by comparison or competition or guilt, which is why what happened next felt like the ground shifting beneath my feet. Like everything I thought I knew about reality was suddenly negotiable. It was a Tuesday evening in December, exactly 20 years and 11 months after Rebecca's accident. Kevin was working late on a difficult case, so I'd come home to an empty house and decided to make myself a proper dinner instead of eating cereal over the sink, like I did when he wasn't there to witness my bachelor habits. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for stir-fry when I heard the front door open. "You're early," I called out, assuming Kevin had wrapped up his paperwork sooner than expected. "Perfect timing. I'm making that cashew chicken you like." Footsteps moved through the living room toward the kitchen, but something about the rhythm was off. Kevin's walk had a deliberate heaviness to it, the gait of someone who'd spent years in work boots. The knife clattered to the floor, and I didn't even hear it hit the tiles. My entire body had gone numb, like someone had unplugged me from the electrical grid that kept me functioning as a rational human being. Rebecca stood there waiting, patient as ever, while I tried to remember how to breathe. "This isn't real," I whispered, my voice coming out scratchy and strange. "You're dead. I went to your memorial service. I visit your grave every year." Rebecca tilted her head to one side, the same gesture she'd made 1,000 times during our childhood, when she was trying to explain something I couldn't quite grasp. "I know how this looks, Rach. I know it doesn't make sense. But I need you to listen to me, okay? There's something you don't understand about what happened that night." My legs gave out, and I found myself sitting hard on the kitchen floor, my back against the cabinet where I kept the good dishes Kevin and I had received as wedding gifts. The cold tiles felt real against my palms. The smell of half-chopped vegetables felt real, but the sister standing in front of me, unchanged by 2 decades of death, felt like something my mind had conjured from grief and pre-wedding stress and too many nights working late in wax. The dark room. "You died," I said again as if repetition could make it true. "Your car went off the road in California. They found blood. They searched for weeks. They found what they were supposed to find," Rebecca said quietly. She dropped her backpack on the floor and crouched down in front of me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same vanilla and jasmine scent she'd worn since high school. "Rachel, I didn't die in that accident. I staged it. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at her face, looking for some sign that this was an elaborate joke, some indication that I was having the world's most vivid hallucination. But her expression was serious, almost apologetic, with none of the playful mischief I remembered from our teenage years. "That's impossible," I breathed. "Why would you do that? Mom and Dad were destroyed. They never recovered from losing you. I spent 20 years believing I was the twin who should have died instead." Rebecca's face crumpled slightly, the first crack in her composed exterior. "I know. God, Rachel, I know what I put everyone through. But I was 19 and terrified. And I thought I was protecting all of you from something worse." "Protecting us from what?" The question came out louder than I intended, anger finally cutting through the shock. "What could possibly be worse than thinking you were dead?" She stood up and began pacing the small space between my kitchen island and the stove, her movements quick and agitated. This was new. Rebecca had always been calm under pressure, the twin who stayed cool during family arguments and school crises. Seeing her nervous and unsettled was almost more disturbing than seeing her alive. "Do you remember senior year, when I was dating Marcus Rivera?" she asked suddenly. I nodded slowly. Marcus had been the golden boy of Desert Ridge High School, quarterback, honor student, headed to Stanford on a full scholarship. Dating him had been another feather in Rebecca's cap, another way she'd outshone me without even trying. What you didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Marcus wasn't the perfect guy everyone thought he was. He was controlling, possessive, and when I tried to break up with him before graduation, he didn't take it well. Rebecca stopped pacing and looked directly at me, her brown eyes darker than I remembered them. "He said if I left him, if I went to USC like I was planning, he would make sure I regretted it. He knew people, Rachel. His father had connections with some very dangerous men through his construction business. Marcus made it clear that he could hurt me, hurt our family, and make it look like accidents." I struggled to process this information. Marcus Rivera, the boy Mom had always said was such a nice young man, the one Dad had joked about wanting to keep around even if Rebecca got tired of him. The idea that he'd been threatening my sister, that she'd been living in fear during those last months of high school, made me feel sick. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I asked. "Why didn't you go to the police? With what proof?" Marcus was smart, Rachel. He never put anything in writing, never left evidence. It was all verbal threats. Intimidation, disguised as romantic jealousy. And his family had money, connections. Who was going to believe that the perfect student-athlete was making death threats against his girlfriend? Rebecca resumed pacing, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "The threats escalated after graduation. He followed me to work, showed up at places he shouldn't have known I'd be. He made it clear that going away to college wouldn't stop him from finding me. So I started making plans. Plans to fake your own death." The words felt surreal coming out of my mouth. Plans to disappear completely. I had been researching it for months, reading about people who had successfully changed their identities. It seemed like the only way to get free without putting the rest of you in danger. I pulled myself up from the kitchen floor, my legs shaky but functional. The familiar space of my home felt foreign now, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. 20 years of carefully constructed life, the marriage, the career, the healing, suddenly felt built on a foundation of lies. "So you decided to traumatize your entire family instead," I said, and I could hear the bitterness in my voice. "You let us grieve for you, let us blame ourselves, let us wonder if we could have done something different to save you." Rebecca flinched as if I'd slapped her. "I was 19, Rachel. I was scared and desperate, and I thought I was out of options. I never meant for it to hurt so much or go on so long." "Go on so long?" The phrase caught my attention. "How long were you planning to stay dead?" "I don't know. A few years maybe. Long enough for Marcus to move on, for the danger to pass. I thought I could come back, eventually, say I'd been kidnapped or had amnesia or something. I thought I could fix it." I stared at my sister, this woman who looked exactly as I remembered her but was describing a level of deception I couldn't comprehend. The Rebecca I'd grown up with had been confident, sometimes arrogant, but never cruel. This plan, letting our parents believe their daughter was dead, letting me spend 2 decades carrying survivor's guilt, felt like something a stranger would do. "What happened?" I asked quietly. Why didn't you come back after a few years? Rebecca's pacing slowed, and she wrapped her arms around herself like she was cold. Because I realized that coming back would be almost as traumatic as disappearing in the first place. Can you imagine what it would have done to Mom and Dad to discover I'd been alive all along? That their grief was unnecessary? That I'd chosen to let them suffer? So instead you let us suffer for 20 years. Instead I got trapped by my own lie. The longer I stayed away, the harder it became to justify coming back. And then life started happening for all of you. You went to college, became successful, got married. Mom and Dad learned to cope with their loss. I convinced myself that you were all better off without me. I walked to the kitchen window and stared out at the December darkness, trying to organize my thoughts. My reflection in the glass looked haggard, older than my 40 years. Behind me, I could see Rebecca's reflection too, still 19, still beautiful, still frozen in time like a photograph. Where have you been? I asked, without turning around. What have you been doing for 20 years? Moving around mostly. I had some money saved, and I got good at creating new identities, finding work that paid cash. I've been a waitress in Texas, a farm worker in Montana, a house cleaner in Colorado. Nothing permanent, nothing that would leave a paper trail that could be traced back to Rebecca Martinez. The casual way she described this nomadic existence made my chest tighten. While I'd been building a life in Portland, establishing roots and relationships and a career that mattered, Rebecca had been drifting through the country like a ghost. It seemed like a terrible waste of the potential she'd always possessed. But you kept track of us, I said. It wasn't really a question. Of course I did. The internet made it easier over the years. I followed your art therapy work, read about your nonprofit. I saw the announcement of your engagement in the Portland paper online. I was so proud of you, Rachel, and so guilty that I couldn't be there to celebrate with you. I turned around to face her, and the expression on her face was something I'd never seen before. A mixture of pride and regret and desperate longing that made her look older than her 19-year-old features should have allowed. If you were proud of me, if you were following my life, then you know what losing you did to me, I said. You know about the therapy, the guilt, the years I spent believing I was the wrong twin. You know I almost didn't survive your death. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since she'd appeared in my kitchen, she looked genuinely remorseful. I know. I've watched from a distance, and I've hated myself for what I put you through. But I also saw you become someone incredible, Rachel, someone you never could have been if you'd stayed in my shadow. The words echoed what she'd said to me the night before she left for USC, her prediction that I would be incredible once I learned to exist independently. But hearing it now, after 20 years of forced independence, felt like salt in an old wound. You don't get to take credit for my growth, I said firmly. You don't get to pretend that traumatizing me was some kind of gift. I became who I am despite losing you, not because of it. You're right, Rebecca said quietly. I'm sorry. I've had a lot of years to rationalize what I did, to find ways to make it seem less selfish. But you're absolutely right. We stood there in silence for several minutes, the weight of 20 years of deception settling between us like a physical presence. I found myself studying her face, looking for signs of the time that had passed, but she remained eerily unchanged. Same smooth skin, same bright eyes, same full lips that had never been touched by worry lines or age spots. How is that possible? I asked suddenly. How do you look exactly the same as you did at 19? Rebecca's expression shifted, becoming guarded in a way that reminded me of childhood secrets. That's complicated. More complicated than faking your own death and staying hidden for 20 years? She sighed deeply and moved to lean against my kitchen counter, her fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the granite surface. The night of the accident, the night I staged my death, something else happened. Something I didn't plan for and still don't fully understand. What kind of something? I had help, Rachel. Someone I met during those months when I was planning my disappearance. Someone who promised they could make me vanish completely, but who failed to mention the full cost of their assistance. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the December weather. The way Rebecca was talking, the careful way she was choosing her words suggested something far stranger than identity fraud and fake documents. "What kind of help?" I pressed. Rebecca looked away, focusing on her hands instead of meeting my eyes. "There are people in this world who can offer solutions to impossible problems, but their help always comes with a price." I was desperate enough to accept help without fully understanding what I was agreeing to. "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I can give you right now," Rebecca said, finally looking at me again. "What matters is that the price included staying exactly as I was when I made the deal. 19 years old. Forever. I can't age, Rachel. I can't change or grow or become anyone different than I was the night I disappeared." I stared at her, waiting for some indication that this was an elaborate joke or a symptom of whatever mental breakdown had brought her back into my life. But her expression was deadly serious, and despite the impossibility of what she was telling me, it explained the one thing that had been bothering me most: how someone could disappear for 20 years and return looking like they'd been preserved in amber. "That's impossible," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them anymore. So is someone coming back from the dead, but here I am. The sound of Kevin's key in the front door made both of us freeze. I'd forgotten that he would be coming home, that my carefully ordered married life was about to collide with this impossible resurrection from my past. Heavy footsteps moved through the living room, accompanied by the familiar sounds of Kevin dropping his briefcase and hanging up his coat. "Rachel," he called out, "sorry I'm so late. The Henderson case got complicated and I couldn't leave until we had a safety plan in place." Rebecca's eyes went wide and she looked toward the kitchen door like a trapped animal. "Who is that?" "My husband," I whispered, panic rising in my throat. "Kevin." "He doesn't know about. He knows you existed, but he thinks you're dead." "Because I am supposed to be dead," Rebecca whispered back urgently. "Rachel, he can't see me like this. How do I explain looking exactly the same as I did 20 years ago? How do we explain any of this?" Kevin's footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear him moving toward the kitchen where he always found me when he came home from work. In a matter of seconds, my husband was going to walk into the room and discover that my dead twin sister was very much alive and hadn't aged a day since her supposed death. "Closet," I hissed, grabbing Rebecca's arm and pulling her toward the small pantry where I kept cleaning supplies and extra dishes. "Get in there, and don't make a sound." "Rachel, this is insane. You can't hide me in a closet." "Do you have a better idea? Because I can't explain this to him right now. I don't even understand it myself." Rebecca allowed herself to be pushed into the pantry just as Kevin rounded the corner into the kitchen. I kicked her backpack under the island and tried to arrange my face into something resembling normalcy, but I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. "Hey," Kevin said, leaning over to kiss my cheek. "How was your day? What's for dinner?" "Good," I managed, my voice only slightly higher than usual. "Fine. Stir-fry. How was yours?" Kevin looked around the kitchen, taking in the half-chopped vegetables scattered across the counter and the knife lying forgotten on the floor. His trained social worker instincts kicked in, and I could see him cataloging the signs that something was wrong. "Everything okay?" he asked carefully. "You seem a little rattled." "Just tired," I lied, bending down to pick up the knife so he wouldn't see my face. "Long day at the center. Mrs. Patterson had another episode during group therapy." It was a plausible excuse. Kevin knew how draining my work could be, how some days left me emotionally depleted and slightly scattered. He accepted the explanation with a sympathetic nod and moved to wash his hands at the sink. "Why don't you sit down and let me finish dinner?" he suggested. "You look like you could use a glass of wine and some decompression time." "That's okay, I've got it," I said quickly, terrified that if Kevin took over cooking duties, he might notice something amiss. Like the fact that I could hear very soft breathing coming from the pantry, or that I kept glancing toward the closet door like a guilty teenager hiding contraband. Kevin studied my face for a moment longer, and I could see him debating whether to push the issue. Finally, he shrugged and moved toward the living room. "I'll be in my office catching up on case notes," he said. "Call me when dinner's ready." I waited until I heard his office door close before letting out the breath I'd been holding. The pantry door opened a crack, and Rebecca peered out like a child playing hide-and-seek. "Is he gone?" "He's working in his office. Rebecca, you can't stay here. Kevin will be back out in an hour expecting dinner, and I can't keep hiding you in closets." Rebecca stepped out of the pantry, brushing dust off her jeans. "I know. I just need a little time to explain everything properly. Can we go somewhere private?" I looked around my kitchen, the heart of the home Kevin and I had built together, and felt like I was betraying everything we'd created just by having this conversation. But Rebecca was my twin, the other half of my genetic code, and even 20 years of anger couldn't completely override the bond we'd shared since birth. "There's a coffee shop about 10 minutes away," I said quietly. "Sunrise Cafe. They stay open late." "Perfect. You go first, and I'll meet you there in 20 minutes. "How do you know where it is?" Rebecca gave me a sad smile. "Rachel, I told you I've been keeping track of your life. I know where you work, where you shop, where you get your morning coffee. I've been watching from a distance for longer than you realize." The thought that she'd been nearby, observing my life like a scientist studying a subject, made me feel exposed and violated, but it also raised questions I wasn't sure I was ready to have answered. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you been in Portland?" 6 months, she admitted. "I came for your wedding, Rachel. I stood in the back of the crowd during the outdoor ceremony and watched you marry Kevin. I was so proud and so heartbroken that I couldn't be there officially." I stared at her, trying to process this latest revelation. She'd been at my wedding, the most important day of my adult life, and I hadn't known. She'd watched me promise to love and honor Kevin without any idea that the ghost of my past was witnessing it all. "Why now?" I whispered. "Why are you telling me this now?" Rebecca's expression grew serious, almost frightened. "Because the deal I made 20 years ago is coming due, and I need your help to break it. And because if I can't find a way out, I'm going to disappear forever, for real this time." Before I could ask what she meant, she grabbed her backpack and headed toward the back door that led to our small patio garden. 20 minutes, she said. Sunrise Cafe. "And Rachel? Don't tell Kevin about this yet, please. Not until you understand everything." She slipped out into the December darkness, leaving me alone in my kitchen with more questions than answers, in the impossible task of pretending to my husband that my entire understanding of reality hadn't just been turned upside down. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the back door and trying to convince myself that the last hour had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But I could still smell Rebecca's perfume in the air, still see the faint footprints her sneakers had left on the kitchen tiles. Whatever was happening, however impossible it seemed, it was real. I called out to Kevin that I was running to the store for ingredients we were missing, grabbed my car keys, and drove through the Portland streets toward what I was certain would be the strangest conversation of my life. Rebecca was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall and a cup of chamomile tea steaming in front of her. She'd chosen the most secluded table in the place, somewhere we could talk without being overheard. I ordered a coffee I didn't want and slid into the seat across from her, studying her face in the cafe's warm lighting. She still looked impossibly young, but there was something in her eyes that seemed older, wearier, like someone who had seen too much and carried too many secrets. "Start from the beginning," I said. "All of it. The real story this time." Rebecca wrapped her hands around her teacup and began to talk, her voice low and urgent in the coffee shop's ambient noise. What she told me over the next 2 hours challenged everything I thought I knew about the world, about my family, and about the price people were willing to pay to escape their mistakes. But more than that, it changed everything I thought I knew about myself and the life I'd spent 20 years building. Because as Rebecca talked, I realized that my sister's story was far from over, and that somehow, impossibly, I was about to become part of it again. Before switching to social work, these footsteps were lighter, quicker, with a familiar bouncing quality that made my knife freeze halfway through a carrot. "Actually," said a voice I hadn't heard in 20 years, "I was hoping for some of that chamomile tea. You know how much I love it when you make it with honey." I turned around slowly, the knife still clutched in my hand, and there she was, Rebecca Martinez, standing in my kitchen doorway like she'd just stepped out of a time capsule. Same dark hair falling in waves past her shoulders. Same bright brown eyes that had always seemed to hold secrets. Same silver earrings catching the overhead light. Same purple backpack slung over one shoulder, slightly faded but unmistakably the one she'd taken to college 19 years ago. She looked exactly as she had the day she left for USC, down to the small scar above her left eyebrow from when we'd crashed our bikes together when we were 12. But I had aged 20 years. I had lines around my eyes from squinting into camera viewfinders and laugh lines from a marriage built on inside jokes. I had gray threads in my hair and hands that showed the wear of darkroom chemicals and garden soil. Next to her eternal 19, I felt ancient and wrong, like I'd broken some fundamental rule of physics. "Hello, Rachel," Rebecca said, and her voice was exactly as I remembered, warm and confident and slightly amused, like she was enjoying a joke I wasn't in on. "I know this is probably a shock, but we need to talk." Rebecca stared into her tea for a long moment, as if the swirling liquid could give her the words to explain the impossible. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes held a kind of exhaustion that seemed to belong to someone much older than her 19-year-old face. "The person who helped me wasn't exactly a person," she began, her voice barely audible above the coffee shop's gentle hum. "Her name was Vera Blackthorne, and I met her 3 weeks before the staged accident. I was working at that little bookstore on Central Avenue, remember? The one that specialized in occult and metaphysical texts?" I nodded slowly. I remembered Rebecca's summer job at Mystic Pages, how she'd come home with stories about the eccentric customers who browsed the tarot cards and crystal displays. Our parents had been mildly disapproving of her working somewhere so unconventional, but the pay was good, and Rebecca had always been drawn to mysteries. Vera came in regularly, always buying books about transformation, renewal, identity magic. She was probably in her 50s, elegantly dressed, spoke with this slight accent I could never place. She seemed to know things about me that I'd never told anyone, including how desperate I was to escape Marcus's threats. Rebecca paused to sip her tea, and I noticed her hands were trembling slightly. Even 20 years later, whatever she was about to tell me still frightened her. One evening, near closing time, Vera cornered me by the herb display and made me an offer. She said she could make me disappear completely, give me a fresh start somewhere Marcus could never find me. But the way she said it, the look in her eyes, I knew she wasn't talking about fake documents or witness protection. What was she talking about? Magic, Rachel. Real, actual magic. The kind our grandmother used to whisper about when she thought we weren't listening, the kind that runs in certain bloodlines and skips generations and costs more than money. I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the December weather outside. Our grandmother, Abuela Esperanza, had indeed whispered about such things during our childhood visits to her small house in Tucson. She'd spoken of curanderas and brujas, of women in our family line who could see beyond the veil between worlds. Our parents had dismissed it as old superstitions, folkloric nonsense that died with previous generations. You believed her? I was 19, and terrified and desperate enough to believe anything that promised a way out. Vera showed me things, Rachel. She lit candles with a gesture, made plants bloom out of season, showed me glimpses of possible futures in her crystal ball. By the time I realized what I was getting myself into, I was already too deep to back out. Rebecca's eyes grew distant, like she was seeing something I couldn't perceive. The ritual took place on the new moon, in a clearing in the desert outside Wickenburg. Vera brought 3 other women, all of them older, all of them carrying this same ageless quality that I didn't understand at the time. They drew circles in the sand with blessed salt, lit fires that burned different colors, chanted in languages that hurt my ears to hear. What did they do to you? They offered me a bargain. Complete disappearance from my old life, a new identity that would be untraceable, and youth preserved until I could find a way to safely return home. In exchange, I would owe them a debt that would be called in exactly 20 years from that night. The implications of what she was saying hit me like a physical blow. 20 years. Rebecca, it's been almost exactly 20 years since you disappeared. I know. The debt comes due on the winter solstice, December 21st. 3 days from now. I stared at my sister, this impossible woman who looked like a teenager but spoke with the weary wisdom of someone who had lived through experiences I couldn't imagine. The coffee shop around us felt suddenly fragile, like the normal world might crack open at any moment to reveal whatever dark currents ran beneath its surface. "What kind of debt?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "That's what I've been trying to figure out for 20 years. Vera was deliberately vague about the terms, and when I tried to contact her after the staged accident, she'd vanished. The bookstore owner said she'd never heard of anyone by that name. The apartment address Vera had given me turned out to be a vacant lot. Rebecca reached into her backpack and pulled out a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and covered in cramped handwriting. I've spent 2 decades researching, trying to understand what I agreed to and how to get out of it. I've traveled to libraries in every major city, consulted with practitioners and scholars, and anyone who claimed knowledge of binding magic." She opened the journal and showed me pages covered with symbols, diagrams, and notes, written in multiple languages. Some of the writing looked like her familiar handwriting from high school, but other sections were in scripts I didn't recognize, as if different people had contributed to the research. What I've learned is that there are beings who exist between our world and others, entities that feed on human life force and potential. They offer bargains to desperate people, always with terms that seem reasonable until it's too late to escape them. I found myself thinking of all the fairy tales our grandmother had told us, stories about deals with mysterious strangers that always came with hidden costs. So Vera wasn't human? I don't think so, no. I think she was something that appears human but exists primarily to harvest energy from our world. And I think the debt I owe isn't money or service but something much more fundamental. Like what? Rebecca closed the journal and looked directly at me, her expression grave. Like my soul, Rachel, I think I traded my soul for 20 years of borrowed time, and now the loan has come due. The words hung between us in the coffee shop's warm air, and I felt reality shift again around the edges. 6 hours ago, I'd been a married woman with a successful career and a settled life, worried about nothing more complicated than wedding planning and year-end budget reports. Now I was sitting across from my supposedly dead twin sister, learning that supernatural entities existed, and that one of them had some kind of claim on Rebecca's essence. "There has to be a way out," I said finally. "Contracts can be broken, deals can be renegotiated. What have you learned in all your research?" "That's why I'm here, why I finally had to break my silence. I found references to something called the twin bond exception. Apparently, in cases where the bargain was made by someone who shares a soul connection with another person, that other person can potentially void the contract by taking on part of the debt." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means you might be able to help me break this binding, but only if you're willing to share the consequences. The research suggests that identical twins have a unique metaphysical connection, that we're essentially 2 halves of the same soul inhabiting separate bodies." Rebecca reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers surprisingly warm despite the cold December evening. "I know I have no right to ask this of you after what I put you through. I know I destroyed your trust and caused you 20 years of pain. But Rachel, you're the only person who might be able to help me, and if we don't do something by the solstice, I don't think I'll exist anymore." I stared down at our joined hands, noting how similar they were despite the 20 years that had aged mine, but not hers. The same long fingers, the same small scar on the ring finger from when we'd tried to blood sister ourselves with a kitchen knife when we were 8 years old. Looking at our hands together, I could almost feel the connection she was talking about, like an invisible thread that had been stretched to its breaking point but never completely severed. What would I have to do? I'm not entirely certain. The sources I found were fragmentary, written in dead languages and referring to practices that haven't been used for centuries. But the basic principle seems to be that if you're willing to acknowledge our twin bond and formally share my debt, the supernatural contract becomes null and void. "And what happens to us if it works?" Rebecca hesitated, and I could see in her expression that there were aspects of this she hadn't told me yet. "We would both return to our natural states." I would begin aging normally again, catching up to where I should be at 39. You would. You might gain some of the years I've been holding in supernatural suspension. The implication hit me immediately. You mean I might get younger? It's possible. The magic has to go somewhere when the binding breaks, and since we share a soul connection, it might redistribute itself between us until we're balanced. I tried to imagine what that would mean, what it would feel like to suddenly be 29 instead of 39, to have a decade of my life reversed while Rebecca gained the years she'd been denied. The idea was both terrifying and strangely appealing, but it also raised practical concerns I couldn't ignore. Rebecca, I have a life here. A husband who loves me as I am, a career, responsibilities. I can't just magically become 10 years younger without there being consequences. I know, and I wouldn't ask if there was any other option. But Rachel, if we don't do this, I'm going to die for real this time. And not just die, cease to exist entirely. The entity that made the bargain will consume whatever essence makes me who I am. The desperation in her voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from my confident, capable twin. Rebecca had always been the one with solutions, the twin who faced problems head-on and emerged victorious. Seeing her reduced to pleading for help from the sister she'd abandoned 20 years ago was perhaps more shocking than learning about the supernatural contract itself. Tell me about the ritual, I said quietly. What would we have to do? Rebecca pulled a folded piece of paper from her journal, a hand-drawn map covered with symbols and notations. It has to take place at the location where the original bargain was made, the clearing in the desert outside Wickenburg. We would need to perform a counter-ritual during the same moon phase, using elements that represent our shared history and separate identities. She pointed to various marks on the map: salt circles to contain the magic, candles blessed with our blood, personal objects that represent who we were before the bargain and who we've become since. And we would need to recite binding words in the old language, essentially rewriting the supernatural contract to include both of us, instead of just me. I studied the map, noting the careful detail with which she'd documented every aspect of the location and ceremony. How do you know this will work? I don't. The sources I found were incomplete, and there's no way to test the theory beforehand. But Rachel, I've spent 20 years researching this, and it's the only solution I've found that doesn't require me to sacrifice someone else's life to break my binding. The casual way she mentioned sacrificing someone else's life made my blood run cold. That was an option? There are always darker paths available to people desperate enough to take them. I could have tried to transfer the debt to an innocent person, could have sought out blood magic that would break my contract at the cost of someone else's soul. But I couldn't do that, not even to save myself. I found myself reassessing everything I thought I knew about my twin sister. The Rebecca I'd grown up with had been self-centered, competitive, willing to take shortcuts when they benefited her. But this woman, shaped by 20 years of consequences and isolation, seemed to have developed a moral compass that prioritized others' welfare above her own survival. What happens if the ritual doesn't work? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring into her now cold tea. If it doesn't work, then at sunset on the winter solstice, Vera, or whatever she really is, will come to collect her debt. I'll be pulled into whatever realm she inhabits, and I'll spend eternity as a source of energy for her kind. And if it does work but goes wrong somehow, then we might both end up in her realm, or we might both cease to exist, or the magical energy might tear us apart on a molecular level. Rachel, I'm not going to lie to you about the risks. This is the kind of magic that kills people when it goes wrong. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was asking. 3 days ago, my biggest concern had been whether to serve chicken or fish at our anniversary dinner next month. Now I was being asked to risk my life, my marriage, and my sanity to save a sister who had put me through 20 years of unnecessary grief. But as I looked across the table at Rebecca's young face marked by old pain, I realized that the choice wasn't really a choice at all. She was my twin, the other half of my genetic code, the person I'd shared a womb with before we'd shared a world. Whatever anger I carried about her deception, whatever resentment I harbored about the years of believing I was the lesser twin, it couldn't override the fundamental connection that had existed between us since before birth. I need to think about this, I said finally. And I need to tell Kevin what's happening. I can't make a decision this big without him knowing why." Rebecca's face fell. "Rachel, if you tell him about the magic, about what I really am, he'll think you've had a breakdown. He'll try to have you committed or medicated or... Kevin loves me. If I tell him I need to help you, even if he doesn't understand the supernatural elements, he'll support me. And if he doesn't, if he tries to stop you..." I thought about my husband, about his rational social worker's mind and his protective instincts where I was concerned. Rebecca was right that he would struggle to believe in magic and supernatural contracts, but she was wrong about his reaction to my involvement. Then I'll have to choose between saving my sister and keeping my husband happy. And Kevin would never forgive himself if he found out later that I'd let you die because he couldn't handle the truth. Rebecca nodded slowly, though I could see she wasn't entirely convinced. "When will you tell him?" "Tonight, as soon as I get home. And then tomorrow we'll drive out to Wickenburg so I can see this clearing for myself. I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with before I commit to anything." "And if you decide you can't do it?" I met her eyes across the small table, seeing in them the same dark brown color that stared back at me from mirrors every morning. "Then we'll find another way. Rebecca, I spent 20 years believing you were dead, and I'm not going to lose you again just because the solution is complicated." For the first time since she'd appeared in my kitchen, Rebecca smiled genuinely, and I caught a glimpse of the sister I'd grown up with, beneath the supernatural drama and the weight of decades-old mistakes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve your help, but thank you for not turning me away." "We're twins," I said simply. "That has to count for something, even after all this time." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the enormity of what lay ahead. Around us, the coffee shop was beginning to close, employees wiping down tables and stacking chairs with the efficient movements of people eager to finish their shifts and go home to normal lives. I envied them that normalcy, the simple certainty of clockwork routines and predictable problems. In 3 days, I would either help my sister break a supernatural contract that threatened her very existence, or I would watch her disappear forever into whatever realm claimed souls foolish enough to make bargains with entities beyond human understanding. "I should get home," I said finally. "Kevin will be wondering where I am, and I need time to figure out how to explain this without sounding like I've lost my mind." Rebecca nodded and stood to leave, shouldering her purple backpack with the same casual gesture I remembered from our teenage years. "Where should we meet tomorrow?" "The parking lot at Papago Park, 10 in the morning. We can drive out to Wickenburg together, and you can show me everything I need to see." And if Kevin wants to come with us? I considered this possibility, weighing the complications of bringing my husband into contact with supernatural forces against the relief of having his steady presence beside me during what promised to be a surreal and possibly dangerous expedition. Then he comes with us. Kevin's dealt with family trauma in his work, and he's stronger than you might think. If we're going to do this, I want him to understand what he's supporting. Rebecca looked like she wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced her that this wasn't negotiable. "All right, but Rachel, if he sees what I really am and decides you're having some kind of psychotic break, then we'll deal with that when it happens. I'm not going to lie to my husband about something this important, and I'm not going to make decisions about my own life based on fear of his reaction." We walked out of the coffee shop together into the December darkness, and for a moment we must have looked like any pair of sisters finishing an evening chat over tea. But the weight of what we'd discussed, the impossible choices that lay ahead, made the ordinary Portland street feel like the edge of an unknown country. "I'll see you tomorrow," Rebecca said, and then she melted into the shadows between streetlights with a grace that seemed more supernatural than natural. I drove home through familiar neighborhoods that suddenly felt foreign, practicing different ways to begin the conversation I needed to have with Kevin. How do you tell someone that your dead twin sister is alive, hasn't aged in 20 years, and needs your help to break a contract with supernatural entities? How do you explain that you're considering risking your life and marriage for someone who let you grieve unnecessarily for 2 decades? By the time I pulled into our driveway, I still hadn't found words that would make the situation sound reasonable. But as I sat in my car, looking at the warm lights of the home Kevin and I had built together, I realized that reasonable wasn't the point. Some things transcended rational explanation, and love, whether for a husband or a sister, was one of them. I found Kevin in the living room, reading case files and making notes for tomorrow's meetings. He looked up when I entered, his expression shifting from casual welcome to concern as he took in what must have been my shell-shocked appearance. "How was the store?" he asked carefully. "You were gone longer than I expected." I sat down beside him on the couch, taking his hands in mine and looking directly into his kind, intelligent eyes. "I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible, and I need you to listen to the whole story before you decide I've lost my mind." Kevin set aside his paperwork and turned to face me fully, his social worker instincts clearly picking up on the seriousness of whatever I was about to share. "Okay, I'm listening." And so, in the quiet sanctuary of our living room, surrounded by the life we'd carefully built together, I began to tell my husband about magic and bargains and the sister who had returned from the dead with 3 days left to live. The conversation that followed would change everything between us, but as I spoke and watched Kevin's expressions cycle through disbelief and concern and finally acceptance, I realized that some foundations are strong enough to bear even impossible truths, and some love is deep enough to encompass decisions that defy rational explanation. By the time I finished talking, Kevin was holding me against his chest, his heartbeat steady and reassuring beneath my cheek. Tomorrow, we would drive into the desert to confront the supernatural consequences of choices made 20 years ago. But tonight, in the quiet of our home, I felt anchored by the certainty that whatever lay ahead, I wouldn't be facing it alone. Kevin's reaction surprised me. After I finished explaining everything about Rebecca's supernatural bargain, the 20 years of deception, and the ritual that might save her soul, he sat quietly for several minutes, his analytical mind processing information that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. "Show me her journal," he said finally. I blinked at him, expecting disbelief or concern about my mental health, not a request for evidence. What? If Rebecca has spent 20 years researching supernatural contracts and binding magic, she must have documentation. As a social worker, I've learned that even the most incredible stories usually have some basis in verifiable fact. I want to see what she's collected. The next morning, Kevin called in sick to work for the first time in the 3 years I'd known him. We met Rebecca in the Papago Park parking lot as planned, and I watched with fascination as my pragmatic husband applied his professional skills to evaluating my sister's impossible situation. "May I?" he asked politely, gesturing toward Rebecca's leather journal. She handed it over with obvious reluctance, clearly uncomfortable with having her research scrutinized by someone she'd never met. Kevin spent 20 minutes examining the pages, studying the symbols and cross-references with the same methodical attention he brought to his most difficult cases. "This is remarkably thorough," he said eventually, looking up at Rebecca with something approaching respect. "You've cross-referenced sources from at least 6 different cultural traditions, and your linguistic analysis shows patterns that would be difficult to fabricate. Either you're the most dedicated con artist I've ever encountered, or you're telling the truth about supernatural entities and binding contracts." "And which do you think it is?" Rebecca asked, her voice carefully neutral. Kevin closed the journal and handed it back to her. "I think my wife has never lied to me about anything important, and she believes what you're telling us. That's enough for me to take this seriously, even if I don't fully understand the mechanics of what you're describing." I felt a rush of love for my husband, so intense it made my chest tight. Kevin might not believe in magic, but he believed in me, and he was willing to extend that trust to encompass even the impossible. The drive to Wickenburg took 2 hours through desert landscape that grew increasingly desolate as we left Phoenix behind. Rebecca navigated from the passenger seat while Kevin drove, directing us along back roads that seemed to lead nowhere until we reached a turnoff marked only by a cluster of ancient mesquite trees. "It's about a mile from here on foot," Rebecca said, shouldering her backpack as we parked beside a dry wash. "The clearing isn't visible from any road, which is why Vera chose it for the original ritual." We hiked through scrubland that looked identical in every direction, following Rebecca's lead as she traced a path that seemed to exist only in her memory. The December sun was bright but lacked warmth, and the desert air carried a sharp clarity that made every sound seem amplified. "There," Rebecca said finally, pointing toward a depression in the landscape ahead of us. The clearing was roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, surrounded by a natural amphitheater of red rock formations. But what made it obviously supernatural wasn't its geography. It was the way the very air seemed different inside its boundaries, thicker somehow, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. Kevin felt it too. I watched him stop at the edge of the clearing and extend one hand cautiously, like he was testing the temperature of bathwater. When his fingers crossed the invisible boundary, he jerked back with a sharp intake of breath. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. "Residual magic," Rebecca explained, stepping confidently into the space. 20 years of accumulated supernatural energy. The original ritual left a permanent mark on this place. I followed her into the clearing and immediately understood Kevin's reaction. The moment I crossed the boundary, I felt like I was walking through water, instead of air, and there was a low humming sound just below the threshold of hearing. But more than that, I felt Rebecca's presence more intensely than I had since we were children, sharing a bedroom and finishing each other's sentences. "You feel it too," she said, watching my face. "The twin bond is stronger here because this is where my natural timeline was severed. In this place, we're still connected to who we were before the bargain changed everything." Kevin remained outside the clearing, clearly uncomfortable with the supernatural energy but unwilling to leave us alone with it. "How exactly would this ritual work?" he called out. Rebecca began walking the perimeter of the clearing, pointing out features that weren't visible unless you knew what to look for. "We would need to arrive at sunset on the solstice, just as the original ritual began. The circles of salt would go here, here, and here, creating a triangle with us at each point. Candles blessed with our blood would mark the cardinal directions, and we would need personal objects that represent our shared past and separate presents." She stopped at the center of the clearing and knelt down, brushing away sand and dried leaves to reveal a circle of stones that had been blackened by some ancient fire. "This is where Vera performed the binding. If the counter-ritual works, this is where the supernatural contract will be dissolved, and the accumulated magic will redistribute itself between Rachel and me." "And if it doesn't work?" Kevin asked. Rebecca's expression grew grim. "Then at the moment of the solstice, Vera will appear to claim her debt, and both Rachel and I will be pulled into whatever realm she inhabits. The ritual either frees us both or condemns us both." I knelt beside Rebecca and placed my hand on the blackened stones. They were warm to the touch, despite the cool December air, and I could feel a faint vibration running through them like a heartbeat. Looking up at my sister's unchanging 19-year-old face, I made a decision that I knew would alter the course of my life, regardless of its outcome. "We're doing this," I said firmly. "Tomorrow night, winter solstice. We're breaking this binding and getting you free." Kevin's voice cut across the clearing with sharp authority. "Not without preparation, we're not. Rebecca, what exactly do we need to gather for this ritual, and how do we know we're doing it correctly?" For the next hour, Rebecca walked us through every detail of the counter-ritual she'd pieced together from decades of research. Salt from the Dead Sea, blessed by practitioners from 3 different traditions. Candles made from beeswax and infused with herbs that grew only during certain moon phases. Personal objects that carried emotional resonance from specific periods of our lives. "The most important elements are the blood bond and the spoken contract," she explained as we prepared to leave the clearing. "We'll need to cut our palms and let our blood mingle in the fire, and then we'll need to recite the binding words in perfect synchronization. If either of us makes a mistake in the pronunciation or timing, the ritual will fail." "And how do we practice reciting words in a dead language without accidentally triggering magical consequences?" Kevin asked pragmatically. Rebecca pulled a small digital recorder from her backpack. "I made this recording 5 years ago when I finally found a scholar who could teach me the correct pronunciation. We'll spend tomorrow practicing until we can recite it perfectly, and then we'll trust that 20 years of preparation was enough." The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd committed ourselves to attempting. Kevin broke the silence as we reached the outskirts of Phoenix. "I'll need to arrange coverage for my cases," he said quietly. "If something goes wrong tomorrow night, if you don't come back or you come back changed, I want to make sure my clients aren't abandoned." The casual way he discussed the possibility of losing me made my throat tighten. "Kevin, you don't have to be part of this. Rebecca and I can handle the ritual ourselves." "Like hell you can," he said with gentle firmness. "Rachel, you're about to attempt something that could kill you or transform you into someone completely different. I'm not letting you face that alone, and I'm sure as hell not sitting at home wondering whether my wife is going to come back from the desert." Rebecca twisted in the passenger seat to look at both of us. Actually, Kevin's presence might strengthen the ritual. The research suggests that emotional bonds can amplify magical workings, and your love for Rachel could provide additional protection during the transformation. "Transform into what, exactly?" Kevin asked. "You've been vague about what happens to Rachel if this works." "Because I honestly don't know," Rebecca admitted. "The sources describe a redistribution of temporal energy, but they don't specify whether that means Rachel becomes younger while I age to catch up, or whether we meet somewhere in the middle, or whether the magic affects us in completely different ways." I found myself thinking about this possibility as we drove through the desert toward home. What would it mean to suddenly be 29 instead of 39? Would I lose the memories and experiences of the past decade? Or would I simply inhabit a younger body with an older mind? Would Kevin still love me if I changed dramatically? And would I still be the same person he'd married? We spent that evening in careful preparation, gathering the ritual components Rebecca had specified, and practicing the pronunciation of words that felt like gravel in my throat. Kevin surprised us both by taking detailed notes and creating backup plans for various scenarios, applying his crisis management skills to supernatural problem-solving with characteristic efficiency. "If the ritual works and you both survive unchanged, we drive home and pretend this never happened," he said, consulting his handwritten checklist. "If it works but transforms you significantly, we'll need to consider how to explain sudden changes to your friends and colleagues. If it fails and you disappear, I'll wait exactly 24 hours before contacting the authorities." "And if we die?" I asked. Kevin's jaw tightened. "Then I'll make sure the world knows that Rebecca Martinez was a real person who deserved better than being forgotten twice." The winter solstice dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline desert air that made distances seem compressed and colors unnaturally vivid. We drove back to the clearing in the late afternoon, arriving as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Rebecca had brought everything we needed in a large canvas bag that looked like it had traveled thousands of miles with her over the years. She moved around the clearing with practiced efficiency, laying out circles of consecrated salt and positioning candles at the cardinal points. Kevin and I helped where we could, but it was clear that she had visualized every detail of this moment countless times. "Personal objects," she said as she finished lighting the candles. "Something from before the bargain, something from during the separation, and something that represents who you want to become." I had brought 3 items after much consideration. A silver bracelet Rebecca had given me for our 16th birthday, representing our shared past. A photograph from my wedding day, representing the life I'd built without her. And a small piece of turquoise I'd picked up on a hiking trail with Kevin, representing the future we wanted to create together. Rebecca's objects were more eclectic. A dried flower pressed between the pages of our high school yearbook, a bus ticket from her first year of exile, and surprisingly, a printed photograph of me receiving an award for my nonprofit work, which she must have taken from a newspaper website. "You chose a picture of me?" I asked, touched, despite everything. "You represent who I want to become," she said simply. "Someone who helps people heal from trauma instead of running away from it." As the sun touched the horizon, we took our positions at the points of the salt triangle. Rebecca and I stood at the base points, with Kevin at the apex, forming a configuration that felt both protective and powerful. The energy in the clearing had intensified with the approaching sunset, and I could feel my skin tingling with static electricity. "Whatever happens," Rebecca said as she pulled out the ritual knife, "I want you to know that I'm grateful, not just for your help with this, but for becoming someone I can be proud to call my sister." "Whatever happens," I replied, extending my hand toward the blade, "we face it together." The blood ritual was surprisingly painless. Rebecca made a small cut across my palm and then across her own, and we pressed our hands together over the central fire. Our blood dripped into the flames, which immediately turned a deep blue color and began burning with twice their previous intensity. "Now," Rebecca said, and we began reciting the counterbinding in unison, our voices blending together in words that seemed to resonate in frequencies beyond normal hearing. I don't remember all the words we spoke, but I remember the feeling of them, like we were unweaving the fabric of reality and stitching it back together in a new pattern. I remember the way the air around us began to shimmer and dance, and the way Rebecca's face seemed to flicker between 19 and 39 as the magic took hold. Halfway through the recitation, the temperature in the clearing dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and a figure materialized on the opposite side of the fire. Vera Blackthorne looked exactly as Rebecca had described her, elegantly dressed and ageless, but her eyes held a fury that made the air around her seem to burn. "You cannot break what was freely given," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made my bones ache. "The bargain was sealed with blood and will, and it belongs to me." "The bargain was made under duress and without full disclosure," Rebecca replied, never pausing in her recitation of the counterbinding. "It is null and void under the laws that govern such contracts." Vera raised one hand, and I felt a tremendous pressure trying to force me to my knees. But Kevin stepped forward, placing himself between the supernatural entity and us, and somehow his presence lessened the magical assault. "You have no power here over freely chosen love," he said, and though his voice shook, his words carried an authority that made Vera hesitate. Rebecca and I reached the climax of the counter-ritual, speaking the final binding words with voices that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The fire in the center of the clearing exploded upward in a column of blue flame that reached toward the darkening sky, and I felt something fundamental shift in the structure of reality around us. The pain was indescribable. It felt like every cell in my body was being taken apart and reassembled, like I was being turned inside out and put back together in a new configuration. I could hear Rebecca screaming, could hear Kevin shouting our names, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. And then, suddenly, it was over. I opened my eyes to find myself lying on the sand in the center of the clearing, with Kevin kneeling beside me and checking my pulse. The candles had burned down to nothing, the salt circles had been scattered by supernatural wind, and there was no sign that Vera Blackthorne had ever been there. "Rachel," Kevin said urgently, "can you hear me? Are you hurt?" I sat up slowly, taking inventory of my body and finding everything apparently intact. My palm, where Rebecca had cut it, was completely healed, without even a scar to mark where the knife had drawn blood. I felt different somehow. Lighter maybe, but definitely still myself. "Where's Rebecca?" I asked, looking around the clearing. "Right here," came a voice from behind me, and I turned to see my sister sitting up on the other side of where the fire had been. But she looked different now. Older, her face marked by lines that spoke of experience and growth. She looked like she was 39 years old, which meant the ritual had worked exactly as we'd hoped. "How do you feel?" I asked her. Rebecca smiled, and it was the same expression I remembered from our childhood, but tempered now by wisdom and maturity. "Like myself for the first time in 20 years. And you? Any sudden urges to go back to college or recapture your lost youth?" I laughed, realizing that I felt no different age-wise, that whatever temporal energy had been released by breaking the binding had gone entirely to Rebecca, rather than being shared between us. "I think I'm exactly the same age I was this morning. Apparently the magic was more interested in making you catch up than making me go backwards." Kevin helped both of us to our feet, and we stood together in the clearing as true darkness settled over the desert. The supernatural energy that had charged the air for 20 years was gone, leaving behind only the clean emptiness of natural space. "Is it over?" Kevin asked. "Is the binding really broken?" Rebecca nodded, pulling out her journal and showing us the pages that had contained her research. The writing was fading as we watched, disappearing like invisible ink exposed to heat, until only blank pages remained. "The contract is dissolved," she said with certainty. "I'm free to live a normal life, to age and change, and make mistakes like everyone else. And I owe it all to both of you." We hiked back to the car in comfortable silence, three people who had faced the impossible together and emerged victorious. But as we drove away from the clearing, I realized that our real challenges were just beginning. Rebecca was now a 39-year-old woman who had been legally dead for 20 years, with no social security number, no official identity, and no way to explain her absence to our parents or the rest of the world. Kevin and I would need to help her build a new life from scratch, and we would need to do it without revealing the supernatural circumstances that had made it necessary. But as I looked at my sister's reflection in the car window, seeing her face finally marked by the years she'd lived, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with magic or ritual success. For the first time since we were children, Rebecca and I were the same age, experiencing life from the same temporal perspective. We were finally truly twins again. The road home stretched out before us in the darkness, leading back to a world where we would need to find new ways to be sisters, where Rebecca would need to discover who she could become when she wasn't running from supernatural consequences, and where Kevin and I would need to figure out how to incorporate this impossible experience into our marriage. But for now, driving through the desert with my husband and my miraculously restored sister, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Rebecca disappeared: the quiet contentment of having my family whole. The drive back to Phoenix felt like emerging from a dream into harsh fluorescent reality. Rebecca sat in the passenger seat, occasionally touching her face with wonder as she discovered new lines around her eyes and mouth, evidence of the 20 years that had finally caught up with her. In the rearview mirror, I could see Kevin processing everything he'd witnessed, his rational mind working to categorize experiences that defied every framework he'd previously used to understand the world. "We need to talk about practical things," Kevin said as we reached the city limits. "Rebecca, you've been legally dead for 2 decades. You have no documentation, no credit history, no medical records from the past 20 years. Building a legitimate identity is going to be complicated." Rebecca nodded, her expression thoughtful in a way I'd never seen when she was actually 19. "I've been thinking about that for months, ever since I realized the binding would have to be broken. I can't just reappear as Rebecca Martinez without raising questions that can't be answered safely." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean, I need to become someone new entirely. Rebecca Martinez died in that car accident, and she needs to stay dead. But maybe there's room in the world for a woman named Becca Morales, someone with a similar background but a different history." Kevin's professional instincts kicked in immediately. Identity creation isn't something you can handle alone, especially not if you want it done legally. But I know people who work with trafficking survivors and undocumented immigrants, people who understand how to help someone start over when traditional systems have failed them. I found myself thinking about the practicalities of integrating a sister back into my life after 20 years of believing she was gone. Our parents would need to be told something, though certainly not the truth about supernatural contracts and binding magic. My friends and colleagues knew I'd had a twin who died in college. How do you explain that your dead sister has suddenly acquired a living cousin who looks remarkably similar? "Mom and Dad," I said suddenly, "we have to tell them something. They've spent 20 years grieving for you, Rebecca. They deserve to know you're alive, even if we can't tell them the whole truth." Rebecca was quiet for a long time, staring out at the familiar Phoenix landscape as we drove through neighborhoods where we'd grown up together. "How do I face them after what I put them through? How do I look them in the eye and explain why I let them believe their daughter was dead?" "Carefully," Kevin said from the driver's seat, "and with a story that protects everyone involved. Rebecca, you were 19 when you made the choice to disappear. You were scared and desperate and making decisions with incomplete information. Your parents will understand that, especially once they have you back." We spent the rest of the drive crafting a cover story that contained as much truth as possible while leaving out the supernatural elements. Rebecca had been threatened by an abusive boyfriend and had staged her death to escape, but instead of dying in the car accident, she'd been rescued by someone who helped her create a new identity. She'd spent 20 years living under assumed names, too afraid to contact family, and too ashamed to reveal she was alive. Only recently had she found the courage to return and attempt reconciliation. It wasn't perfect, and anyone who looked too closely would find holes in the timeline, but it was believable enough to satisfy casual questions and emotional enough to explain our parents' inevitable confusion and anger. "We should call them tomorrow," Rebecca said as we pulled into our driveway. "I don't want to wait any longer than necessary. I've already stolen 20 years from them. I won't steal another day." Kevin offered to let Rebecca stay in our guest room while she figured out her next steps, an offer that surprised me with its generosity. My husband had just discovered that his entire understanding of reality was incomplete, had risked his life participating in a supernatural ritual, and now he was volunteering to house my formerly dead sister while she rebuilt her existence from scratch. "Are you sure?" I asked him as we stood in our kitchen, the same space where Rebecca had appeared less than 48 hours earlier. "This is going to complicate our lives in ways we can't even predict yet." "Rachel, 3 days ago our biggest concern was whether to buy a new dishwasher or repair the old one. Today we broke a supernatural contract and restored your sister's natural timeline. I think we can handle some mundane complications." Kevin's ability to adapt to impossible circumstances was just one of the reasons I'd fallen in love with him, but seeing him extend that adaptability to embrace Rebecca felt like watching him choose our future together in real time. He was making space in our carefully ordered life for chaos and complications, and the messy business of family reconstruction. That night I lay awake listening to Rebecca moving around in the guest room across the hall, and I realized I was experiencing a kind of grief in reverse. For 20 years I'd mourned the loss of my twin, the conversations we'd never have, the experiences we'd never share. Now I had her back, but the woman sleeping in our guest room wasn't the 19-year-old who disappeared. She was someone new, shaped by 2 decades of solitude and consequence, and I would need to learn who she'd become just as she would need to learn who I'd grown into. The next morning brought the conversation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. We drove to our parents' house in Ahwatukee, the same suburb where Rebecca and I had grown up competing for attention and approval. The desert landscaping looked exactly the same as it had 20 years ago, but the house seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of grief it had contained. Mom answered the door wearing gardening clothes and the distracted expression she'd carried since Rebecca's memorial service, but her face went completely blank when she saw Rebecca standing on the front step. For a moment I thought she might faint or slam the door or scream. Instead, she said the most ordinary thing imaginable. "You look just like my daughter. I am your daughter," Rebecca said quietly. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for everything." What followed was 3 hours of the most emotionally exhausting conversation of my life. Mom called Dad home from his Saturday morning golf game, and we sat in the living room where Rebecca and I had once practiced piano duets and argued over television channels, trying to explain 20 years of deception and absence. Our parents cycled through every emotion imaginable. Disbelief gave way to anger, which transformed into relief, which collapsed into confusion, which rebuilt itself as cautious joy. Dad demanded proof that this woman was really his daughter, then spent an hour testing Rebecca's memory of family details only she would know. Mom alternated between holding Rebecca like she might disappear again and maintaining careful distance as if she were afraid to believe this reunion was real. "The memorial service," Mom said at one point, her voice breaking. "We buried an empty casket. We've been visiting an empty grave for 20 years. "I know," Rebecca replied, tears streaming down her face. "I've driven past the cemetery so many times, wanting to tell you I was alive but not knowing how to fix what I'd broken." Dad was quieter in his anger, but I could see it burning behind his eyes as he struggled to process the magnitude of what Rebecca had done. "You let us believe you were dead. You let us grieve for you, blame ourselves for not saving you, wonder what we'd done wrong as parents." "You didn't do anything wrong," Rebecca said firmly. "I was scared and stupid and 19, and I made a terrible decision that hurt everyone I loved. But you were perfect parents, and I was lucky to have you even if I was too young to appreciate it." The reconciliation wasn't clean or simple. Our parents would need time to rebuild their relationship with a daughter who was no longer the teenager they remembered, and Rebecca would need to learn how to be part of a family again after 20 years of self-imposed exile. But by the time we left that afternoon, there were tentative plans for regular dinners and careful steps toward healing. "They hate me," Rebecca said as we drove home. "They don't hate you," I corrected. "They're processing the most impossible thing that's ever happened to them. Give them time to adjust to having you back. Kevin, who had remained diplomatically quiet during the family reunion, finally spoke up. Rebecca, they spent 20 years mourning the daughter they lost. Now they get to spend the rest of their lives celebrating the daughter they recovered. That's not a small gift. Over the following weeks, Rebecca began the slow process of rebuilding a legal identity with help from Kevin's professional contacts. Becca Morales emerged on paper as a woman with a documented history of domestic abuse, who had lived off the grid for 20 years before seeking assistance to reintegrate into society. It was a common enough story in Kevin's line of work that the documentation process, while complex, didn't raise unusual suspicions. Rebecca moved into a small apartment downtown, close enough to maintain regular contact, but far enough to give all of us space to adjust to this new family dynamic. She got a job at a nonprofit that helped trauma survivors, work that drew on her own experiences with reinvention and healing. Watching her find purpose in helping other people rebuild their lives felt like a form of cosmic justice. The hardest part wasn't the practical challenges of identity creation or family reconciliation. It was learning how to be twins again when we were no longer the people we'd been before her disappearance. Rebecca and I had to rediscover each other as adults, had to figure out how to maintain our connection without falling back into old patterns of competition and comparison. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked me one evening as we sat in my backyard watching Kevin work in his vegetable garden. "Do you ever wish I'd stayed dead so you could keep the life you built without complications?" I considered the question seriously, thinking about how much easier my life would be without the constant need to explain my sister's reappearance, without the ongoing process of family reconstruction, without the knowledge that supernatural forces existed just beneath the surface of ordinary reality. "No," I said finally. "I spent 20 years learning to live without you, and I got good at it. But I never stopped missing the conversations we never had, the experiences we never shared. Having you back is complicated and sometimes difficult, but it's also the completion of something that was broken in me when you disappeared." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised me. "I'm jealous of you, you know. You've spent 20 years growing and changing and becoming someone complete. I've spent 20 years frozen in time, unable to move forward or backward. Looking at your life, your marriage, your career, I realize how much I lost by choosing to disappear." "You didn't lose those years," I said. "You just lived them differently. And now you get to use what you learned during that time to build something new." 6 months after the ritual in the desert, Rebecca met someone. David Chen was a trauma counselor who worked with veterans, a quiet man in his early 40s who understood what it meant to help people rebuild their lives after impossible experiences. When Rebecca told me about him, I felt something I hadn't experienced since we were teenagers: genuine happiness for my sister's romantic life, without any undercurrent of competition or comparison. "He doesn't know about the supernatural stuff," she said over coffee one Saturday morning. "I told him I was in witness protection for 20 years, which is close enough to the truth. But I think eventually, if things get serious, I'll need to share more of the real story." "How much more?" "All of it. If I'm going to spend my life with someone, he deserves to know who I really am and where I've been. I won't build another relationship on partial truths and hidden history." I found myself thinking about the difference between the Rebecca who had made a supernatural bargain at 19 and the woman who was now choosing radical honesty in her relationships. 20 years of consequences had taught her the cost of deception in ways that ordinary aging might not have. My own marriage had deepened in unexpected ways since the night Kevin witnessed supernatural forces and chose to support me anyway. There's something profound about having a partner who has seen you face the impossible and still chooses to build a life with you. Kevin and I had always been honest with each other, but now our honesty extended to include the knowledge that reality was far stranger and more malleable than either of us had previously imagined. "Do you think there are other people like Rebecca out there?" Kevin asked me one evening as we lay in bed discussing the day's events. "Other people who've made bargains with supernatural entities, who are living with magical consequences?" "Probably," I said. Rebecca's research suggested that these entities have been offering deals to desperate people for centuries. We might have neighbors who are older than they appear, or younger, or who've traded years of their lives for other things entirely. The thought was both fascinating and unsettling. If magic was real, if supernatural contracts were possible, then how many other impossible things were happening just outside the edges of normal perception? How many people were walking around with secrets that would redefine everything we thought we knew about the world? Rebecca's relationship with our parents continued to heal slowly but steadily. Dad never quite forgave her for the 20 years of unnecessary grief, but he learned to appreciate the woman she'd become and the wisdom she'd gained from her unconventional journey. Mom threw herself into making up for lost time, planning family gatherings and holidays that included both of her daughters for the first time in 2 decades. The strangest moments came when people who had known Rebecca before her disappearance encountered her now. Old high school classmates would do double takes when they saw her at coffee shops or grocery stores, trying to reconcile their memories of a 19-year-old girl with this clearly adult woman who looked familiar but impossibly different. "I ran into Marcus Rivera last week," Rebecca told me one afternoon. "Remember him, the boyfriend whose threats started this whole mess?" I felt a chill run through me. Marcus had been the catalyst for Rebecca's original decision to fake her death, the threat that had driven her to seek supernatural solutions. What happened? He's 45 now, married with 3 kids, completely ordinary. He looked at me like he was trying to place where he knew me from, but he didn't make the connection. To him, I was just another face in the crowd. How did that feel? Anticlimactic, Rebecca admitted with a laugh. I spent 20 years afraid of a man who turned out to be just another middle-aged suburbanite, worried about his mortgage and his kids' soccer schedules. It made me realize how much power I'd given to fear, how many years I'd lost to being afraid of someone who'd probably forgotten I existed within a year of graduation. This revelation seemed to liberate something in Rebecca. She began taking risks again, making long-term plans, investing in relationships and experiences with the confidence of someone who was no longer running from her past. She signed a lease on a larger apartment, adopted a dog from the shelter, started dating David seriously. "I'm thinking about going back to school," she told me one evening as we walked through the botanical garden where we'd once brought our grandmother during her visits to Phoenix. "Maybe getting a degree in social work or counseling, something that would let me use what I've learned about transformation and healing. At 39, starting over academically? Why not? I've already started over in every other way imaginable. Besides, I have 40 or 50 years ahead of me now to build something meaningful. That's a luxury I never thought I'd have." The first anniversary of Rebecca's return approached on a warm December evening that reminded me of the night she'd first appeared in my kitchen. Kevin and I were hosting a small dinner party, one of many we'd held over the past year as we'd worked to integrate Rebecca back into our social circle. Rebecca arrived with David, and I watched my sister move through our house with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there. She helped Kevin with the cooking, told stories that made our guests laugh, participated in conversations about current events, and shared experiences with the natural grace of someone who had learned to live fully in the present. Later, after our guests had gone home and David had left for his own apartment, Rebecca and I sat on the back patio, sharing a bottle of wine and reflecting on everything that had changed since her supernatural reappearance. "Do you ever miss it?" I asked her. "Being 19 forever, having unlimited time ahead of you?" Rebecca considered the question, swirling wine in her glass as she watched Kevin clean up in the kitchen. "No," she said finally. Being 19 forever meant never growing, never learning from mistakes, never becoming anyone different than I was at my most immature moment. I'd rather have 40 years of actual living than an eternity of being stuck as my teenage self. And the magic! Do you miss having access to supernatural forces? Magic comes with a price, Rachel, always. I traded 20 years of growth for 20 years of youth, and even though things worked out in the end, it wasn't worth it. The most magical thing in my life now is ordinary stuff. Watching David sleep, having dinner with our parents, seeing you happy in your marriage. Real magic doesn't require supernatural contracts. As the evening wound down and Rebecca prepared to leave, she pulled something out of her purse and handed it to me. It was a small wrapped box, clearly a gift of some kind. "What's this for?" I asked. "Open it and see." Inside the box were 2 silver bracelets, clearly handmade, each engraved with a single word. Mine said Rachel in flowing script, while the other said Rebecca in identical lettering. I had them made by a jeweler downtown, Rebecca explained. I wanted something that would remind us that we're twins again, that we're the same age, and living in the same timeline, and choosing to be sisters by choice, instead of just biology. I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist, feeling the cool weight of silver against my skin. It's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for saving my life, Rebecca said simply. Thank you for risking everything to help someone who probably didn't deserve it. Thank you for giving me the chance to become someone worth saving. We hugged goodbye on my front step, a gesture that felt both familiar and completely new. For 20 years, I dreamed of moments like this, ordinary sister interactions that I'd thought were lost forever. Now I had them back, not because of magic or supernatural intervention, but because love had proven stronger than fear, and family had proven more resilient than trauma. As I watched Rebecca drive away to her own life, her own apartment, her own future, I felt a contentment that had nothing to do with achievement or success, or any of the measures I'd used to evaluate my life for the past 2 decades. I felt complete in a way that had nothing to do with accomplishing goals and everything to do with having the people I loved within reach. Kevin found me standing in the doorway, still wearing the silver bracelet and smiling at nothing in particular. "Good evening?" he asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "Perfect evening," I replied, leaning back against his chest and feeling grateful for the ordinary miracle of his presence, the supernatural blessing of having both my sister and my husband in my life at the same time. The next morning brought a phone call that I initially thought was a wrong number. A woman with a slight accent asked to speak with Rachel Martinez about a matter involving supernatural contracts and family obligations. When I confirmed my identity, she introduced herself as Elena Vasquez, a scholar of folklore and metaphysical studies who had been researching the entity I knew as Vera Blackthorne. "I understand you recently broke a binding contract with Vera," Elena said. "I'm calling because there may be others in similar situations who could benefit from what you learned during your experience." The conversation that followed opened up possibilities I hadn't considered. Elena explained that she worked with a network of practitioners and scholars who helped people escape supernatural contracts, that Rebecca and I weren't the only ones who had faced such situations, and that our successful counter-ritual could potentially help others trapped in similar bindings. "Would you be willing to document your experience?" Elena asked. "Not for publication, but for a confidential database of successful escape strategies. There are other twins out there, other siblings, other family members, who might be able to use your approach to break contracts that are destroying their lives." I found myself thinking about Rebecca's new career helping trauma survivors, about the way she'd turned her own experience with transformation into something that could benefit others. Maybe there was a way for both of us to use what we'd learned about supernatural contracts and family bonds to help other people escape similar situations. "I'll need to discuss it with my sister and my husband," I told Elena. "But yes, I think we'd be willing to help if we can." When I called Rebecca to tell her about Elena's request, she was immediately interested. "Rachel, what if this is what I was supposed to learn from 20 years of magical consequence? What if the whole point was to become someone who could help other people escape the same kind of trap?" We met with Elena the following week at a small cafe in downtown Phoenix, and what she told us about the scope of supernatural contracts in the modern world was both fascinating and terrifying. According to her research, thousands of people worldwide were living with the consequences of bargains made with entities like Vera Blackthorne, many of them unaware that escape was possible. "The entities rely on isolation and despair," Elena explained. "They convince people that their contracts are permanent, that there's no way out except through death or worse consequences. But family bonds, especially twin bonds, create vulnerabilities in these contracts that can be exploited if people know how." Over the following months, Rebecca and I became part of Elena's network, documenting our experience and occasionally consulting with other families who were facing similar situations. We learned about siblings separated by time displacement spells, parents who had traded their aging for their children's safety, couples who had bargained away their ability to touch each other in exchange for supernatural protection. Each case was different, but the underlying principles remained the same. Love was stronger than magic, family bonds could override supernatural contracts, and there was always a way out for people brave enough to risk everything for each other. The work was sometimes dangerous, and always emotionally exhausting. But it gave both Rebecca and me a sense of purpose that transcended our own recovery. We were using the hardest experience of our lives to help other people reclaim their agency from entities that fed on desperation and fear. 2 years after Rebecca's return, Kevin and I decided to buy a larger house, one with enough space for the extended family gatherings that had become a regular part of our lives. Rebecca and David were engaged by then, planning a wedding that would include all the family members who had missed her first attempt at building a life. "Do you think we'll ever tell David the whole truth?" I asked Rebecca one afternoon as we toured potential venues for her reception. "I already have," she admitted. "Last month, when we started planning the wedding seriously, I realized I couldn't marry him without him knowing exactly who he was marrying and what our family has been through." How did he take it? Better than I expected. He said it explained a lot about my approach to trauma counseling and my ability to help people who've experienced impossible things. He also said that after working with veterans for 15 years, he'd learned to believe in things that couldn't be easily explained. And he's okay with potentially becoming part of Elena's network? He's okay with whatever makes me happy. And helping other people escape supernatural contracts makes me very happy. Rebecca's wedding took place on a spring morning in the same desert that had witnessed her supernatural binding and release. The ceremony was held in a different location, a botanical garden, where the only magic was the natural kind that made flowers bloom and birds sing. But there was poetry in celebrating her new beginning in the landscape where she'd once been trapped. I stood beside my sister as her maid of honor, wearing a dress that matched my natural age and holding flowers that smelled like hope and new possibilities. As Rebecca exchanged vows with David, promising to love him with full knowledge of who she'd been and who she was becoming, I felt the satisfaction of watching someone I loved choose truth over convenience, honesty over safety. Our parents sat in the front row, crying tears of joy they'd never thought they'd get to shed. Kevin served as David's best man, having formed an unlikely but genuine friendship with the man who was becoming Rebecca's husband. Elena sat with her partner in the third row, probably the only wedding guest who fully understood the supernatural journey that had led to this moment. During the reception, Rebecca pulled me aside for a private conversation in the garden's quiet corner. "I have something to tell you," she said, her expression serious enough to make me worried. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. But Elena thinks there might be a way to trace other members of our family who have been affected by supernatural contracts. She's found records suggesting that our grandmother's stories about curanderas and brujas weren't just folklore." I felt a familiar chill of possibility mixed with apprehension. "You think Abuela Esperanza was involved with magic?" "I think our family has a longer history with supernatural forces than we realized. And there might be other relatives who need help escaping contracts they made decades or even generations ago. Elena wants to know if we'd be interested in expanding our work beyond just helping strangers." The idea of uncovering hidden family history involving magic and supernatural contracts was both thrilling and terrifying. But looking around at the wedding reception, seeing the life Rebecca had built after escaping her own magical consequences, I realized that some adventures were worth the risk. What would that involve? Research trips to Tucson and Mexico, interviews with elderly relatives who might know more than they've shared, possibly discovering family members we never knew existed. It could be dangerous, Rachel. Entities like Veridon Blackthorn don't give up their contracts easily, and if we start unraveling a network of family bindings, we might attract attention we don't want. I thought about the ordinary life Kevin and I had built, the quiet satisfaction of our work and marriage, and carefully constructed routine. Then I thought about the extraordinary experience of saving my sister's soul, the profound meaning that had come from using our own trauma to help other people escape similar situations. "When do we start?" I asked. Rebecca's smile was radiant, the expression of someone who had learned to embrace challenge instead of running from it. "Elena wants to begin with Abuela's old house in Tucson. Apparently the previous owners reported some unusual phenomena that might indicate residual magical activity." As we rejoined the wedding reception, I found Kevin chatting with David about work and discovered that my husband had already figured out what Rebecca and I were discussing. Family history research? He asked with knowing amusement. Something like that, I admitted. Well, I've got vacation time accumulated, and I've always wanted to see more of Arizona. Count me in for whatever impossible adventure you two are planning next. Standing there in the botanical garden, surrounded by family and friends celebrating Rebecca's new beginning, I realized that the best kind of magic wasn't supernatural at all. It was the ordinary miracle of love that refused to be destroyed by time or distance or even death. The extraordinary power of family bonds that could survive deception and loss and transformation. My twin sister had spent 20 years frozen at 19, trapped by a supernatural contract that promised safety but delivered only isolation. Now she was 39 and married and building a life based on truth instead of fear, using her experience with magical consequence to help other people reclaim their agency from entities that fed on desperation. I had spent 20 years learning to live without her, becoming someone complete and independent and strong enough to risk everything for family. Now I was part of a network of people who understood that reality was far stranger than it appeared, that magic existed in both supernatural and ordinary forms, and that love was the most powerful force in any realm. As the evening wound down and we prepared to go home to our respective lives, Rebecca caught my hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what this time? For believing that some people are worth saving twice." I looked at my sister, this woman who shared my face and my history but had become someone entirely her own, through the strange alchemy of loss and recovery and choice. Tomorrow we would begin investigating family secrets that might span generations and involve supernatural contracts we couldn't yet imagine. Tonight, we were simply twins again, bound by love instead of desperation, choosing each other instead of being trapped together. Always, I said, and meant it completely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.